Historical Memoirs of the Irish Bards, interspersed with anecdotes of and occasional observations on the music of Ireland. Also, an historical and descriptive account of the musical instruments of the Ancient Irish, and an appendix containing several biographical and other papers with select Irish melodies by Joseph C. Walker, a member of the Royal Irish Academy, printed for the author by Luke White in 1786. The history of the Irish bards, says a celebrated writer, is perhaps, of all others, the most extraordinary. The following memoirs will, we trust, both illustrate and establish this position. The early ages of every nation are enveloped in dark clouds, impervious to the rays of historic light. An attempt, therefore, to trace the arts of poetry and music to their source in this or in any country must be unsuccessful. They are coeval with its original inhabitants, for man is both a poet and a musician by nature. But our business with those arts does not commence till an order of men who, for some time united both characters, appears in the annals of Ireland. Every event recorded to have happened in this kingdom during the First or Fabulous Age is of questionable authority, yet they are not to be passed over entirely unnoticed by the historian. The voice of the songs of early Irish bards and the glimmering lights of tradition often bewilder their followers, but they sometimes lead them to truth. In the 10th year of the last Belgic monarch, a colony called by the Irish Tuatha Dé Danann of the posterity of Nemedius invaded and soon after settled themselves in Ireland. This name, according to some antiquaries, they owed to their being divided into 3 tribes: the nobility, who are so called from Tuatha, a lord; the priests from Dee, God, as being devoted to the service of God; and the Danans, the poets or bards from Dan, meaning a poem, who composed hymns and sung the praises of the Supreme. Here, mention of the bardic profession occurs for the first time in the history of Ireland. But as this relation comes but weakly supported, and as the derivation of its name rests on conjecture, little reliance is to be had on either. Let us then proceed to that period in which history wears a semblance of truth. We mean the invasion of the Milesians. The princes Heremon and Heber were the first of the Milesian race who landed in Ireland with a hostile intent. Their arms, having prevailed over the Danonians, and their power being firmly established, they set themselves to cultivate the arts of peace. They made an equal partition of the kingdom. They cleared the lands of the woods with which they were overrun. They erected palaces, rude indeed in their construction, and their chiefs raised dunes or fortifications. Their brother, Amergine, assumed the dignity of Archdruid and the rank of Ardfili, or chief bard, a rank which imposed on him the several offices of poet, historian, and legislator. This was probably the true era of the orders of Druids and Bards in this kingdom. Quote, "Mute till then was every plain, save where the flood o'er mountains rude tumbled his tide awine, an echo from the impending wood. Resounded the hoarse strain, while from the north the sullen gale, with hollow whistlings shook the vale, dismal notes and answered soon by savage howl the heaths among. What time the wolf doth bay the trembling moon, and thin the bleating throng." End quote. It is the opinion of the elegant antiquary Dr. T. Wharton that the bardic institution was introduced from the East, and it now begins to appear from the researches of Colonel Valency that everything we owe to the Milesians has an Oriental origin. That the arts of poetry and music obtained amongst the Milesians, both before and after their arrival in this kingdom, is evident from the following tradition. Cirma Kiss, a poet, and Anna Cianfin, a harper, accompanied the princes, Heremon and Heber, in their expedition. They were both eminent in their different professions, and in such high estimation with the two princes that there was an amicable contest to which of them the tuneful artists should belong. It was at length agreed that they should be separated, and that the division be determined by lot. The poet fell to Heremon, the musician to Heber. As the southern division of the island was Heber's territory, some of our writers have hence observed that those parts are more particularly delighted with and skilled in music. This is problematic, yet it is possible, as Dr. Warner remarks, that this contest between the princes in the infancy of their settlement might have given birth, as the old chronicles expressly tell us it did, to that laudable custom among the Irish of treating their poets, historians, and literati with honour and liberality. Our historians observed our profound silence with respect to the bards till Tighearnmas succeeded to the monarchy AM 2815. This prince, not less glorious in arms than wise in counsel, being desirous of confining every rank of his people within its proper sphere, ordained a sumptuary law called the Ilbreachta for that purpose. By this law, the peasantry, soldiers, and lower order of the people were to have their garments of but one colour. Military officers and private gentlemen, 2. Commanders of battalions, 3. Beatachs, rulnibs, and keepers of houses of hospitality, 4. The principal nobility and knights, 5. And the Ullivs, or dignified bards, 6, which was only one colour less than was worn by the royal family. Can that nation be deemed barbarous in which learning shared the next honours to royalty? Warlike as the Irish were in those days, even arms were less respected amongst them than letters. Read this, ye polished nations of the earth, and blush. Having thus brought the bards forward to notice in so honourable a manner, we will arrest the course of this little history in order to dilate on the mode of their education, on their offices, and their privileges. At an immemorial period, seminaries or colleges were instituted in different parts of the kingdom for the education of the bards. These institutions, intended for the quiet retreat of learning, were sunk in the bosom of deep woods of oak. The garish eye of the day was excluded from them, and their members studied by the light of tapers and lamps. Though their immunities were considerable, the diet and dress of the students were regulated by the most rigid rules of prudence. The lures of pleasure were prescribed by the nature of the institutions, and the state turned the foot of rapine from those academic shades. Thus the attention, in the honour of study of meditation, was never diverted from the false glare of external objects by the quote, voice of the charmer, or by the dread of the spoiler. All was gloomy and peaceful, silent and awful. Here the heart-corroding cares of life found no admission. Here, genius was fostered and the soul sublimed. It was in those seminaries that the Druids instilled into the minds of the bards the rudiments of history, oratory, and laws, through the medium of poetry, in which was wrapped all the knowledge of those ages. Quote, "Their laws, their systems of psychic and other sciences," says Keating, "were poetical compositions and set to music, which was always esteemed the most polite part of learning amongst them." End quote. As it was the policy in those times to confine the use of letters, so long known in this kingdom, to the professors of learning, the Druids deemed it necessary to imprint on the minds of their bardic pupils all the knowledge they inculcated, verbum verbo as they delivered it, enjoining them to diffuse it orally, but teaching them, however, at the same time, the ogham be. Hence, the course of a bard's education was seldom completed in less than 12 years. Sometimes the young bard, in order to relieve his mind from the severity of academic studies, essayed the artless tale as he wandered through his groves, obeying the dictates of his own feelings and painting from the rude scenes around him. Quote, "Whate'er of beautiful or new, sublime or dreadful in earth, sea or sky, by chance or search was offered this view, he scanned with curious and romantic eye." End quote. Too often credulous historians have been deceived by these tales, in which the truth was either disguised under the mask of fiction or entirely disregarded. Quote, "The poets used for invention's sake," says the voluminous Holinshead, "to feign such dreaming fables for exercise of their styles and wits. Afterwards, through error and lack of knowledge, they have been taken with the ignorant for very true and most assured histories." End quote. But it is not necessary to consult them as historic guides, since so many volumes of well-authenticated records have escaped the ravages of time and of foreign spoilers. Soon as the student had finished his course, an honorary cap called a ballad and the degree of Ullagh or doctor were conferred on him. Then he was supposed sufficiently qualified to fill any office of his order, and the most learned of these Ullaghs were sometimes admitted into the order of the Druids. Youth, it is true, were received indiscriminately into those seminaries for education, but those who were intended for the Bardic order must be peculiarly qualified. As every profession was hereditary, the candidates for the Bard necessarily belonged to certain families. Besides, it was required that they should have genius for poetry and music. Their understandings must be vigorous, their memories retentive, and their persons made in the prodigality of nature. In the education of the bards, music, as we have already hinted, was not forgotten, nor were they allowed to be unacquainted with the use of arms. Hence many of them, like Uiscin, boast their prowess in battle. It is not improbable that the use of arms was made one of their academic exercises of the recreative kind, upon the same principle that Milton recommends it in his celebrated Letters on Education. Quote, "The exercise," says he, "which I command first, is the exact use of their weapon, to guard and to strike safely with the edge or point. This will keep them healthy, nimble, strong, and well in breath, is also the likeliest means to make them grow large and tall, and to inspire them with the gallant and fearless courage, which being tempered with seasonable lectures and precepts to them of true fortitude and patience, will turn into a native and heroic valour, and make them hate the cowardice of doing wrong." End quote. When a young bard had received the degree of Ullagh, the choice of his profession was determined by that of the family to which he belonged. He was either a Filidh, a Breitheamh, or a Seanacha by birth. Offices which had long met in the same person, but were about this time disunited, being found to be too complex for one man. The Tighearnmas Dan, or Filidh, were, as the name literally implies, poets. They turned the tenets of religion into verse, they animated the troops, before and during an engagement and raised the war song. They celebrated the valorous deeds and wrote the birthday odes and the epithalamiums of the chieftains and princes who entertained them, and, at the feast of the hill, amused them with the tales of other times, which they modulated to the harp, an instrument which every member of the Bardic order could touch with a master hand. But the Filidh had other offices assigned to them. They were the heralds and constant attendants in the field of battle of the chiefs whom they served, marching at the head of their armies, arrayed in white flowing robes, harps glittering in their hands, and their persons surrounded by Orifidigh, or instrumental musicians. While the battle raged, they stood apart and watched in security every action of their chief, in order to glean subjects for their lays. Quote, "The muse her piercing glances throws around, and quick discovers every worthy deed." End quote. But it was not in the field alone that the Filidh was to mark the actions of his chief. He was to watch over him in private. Quote, "Although it behooved every man to instruct his prince," sings an old Irish bard, "it is the particular office of the Filidh, for to him the prince gives the greatest attention. How arduous then the Filidh's task, for it behoveth him to mark each backsliding, and not to overlook even a tendency to evil." End quote. Some of our bards were prophets too. Mr. O'Connor expressly says that, quote, "Many of our druids and bards pretended to the gift of prophecy. They often imposed," he continues, "on the credulity of the great, as well as our little vulgar, and some, foreseeing effects in their causes, we cannot wonder that many of their predictions were verified, and that they obtained credit on that account." End quote. Indeed, the poetical remains of the latter, like those of the ancient Welsh bards, teem with predictions. But probably it is to the order of bards now before us, that of the Filidh, that we are to confine those who affected to be inspired. For the nature of the other orders precluded the indulgence of poetic enthusiasm which begets inspiration. Here we will gratify the reader of taste with Mr. Mason's glowing description of a bard in the moment of inspiration. "He is entranced. The Filidh bursts that bound, his liberal locks, his snowy vestments fall, his ampler folds, and all his floating form doth seem to glisten with divinity. Applaud the valiant and the base control, disturb, exalt, enchant the human soul." The Brehons, or Brehons, or legislative bards, promulgated the laws in a kind of recitative or monotonous chant, seated on an eminence in the open air. The Brehons acted also in the double capacity of judges and legislators. They dispensed justice and assisted in framing the Breitheamh, or laws. The Seanacha were antiquaries, genealogists and historians. They recorded remarkable events and preserved the genealogies of their patrons in a kind of unpoetical stanza. Each province, prince and chief had a Seanacha, and we will venture to conjecture that in each province there was a repository for the collections of different Seanacha belonging to it, with the care of which an Olaf Race Seanacha was charged. Besides these three orders of bards, there was another of an inferior kind, which we will arbitrarily call the Order of the Orifidigh. In this order were comprised the Chlanni, the Cruthari, the Ciotari, the Tighearnmas, and the Cualanach, all of whom took their several names from the instruments on which they professedly played. The head of this order was entitled Olaf Ray Ceol. Where these musicians were instructed in the rudiments of their art will appear elsewhere, but we will here observe that their profession, as well as those of the higher classes of the bards, was likewise hereditary. Our researches concerning the dress of the ancient bards of Ireland have been more sedulous than successful. We determined to consult on this head the learned author on the dissertation on the origin and language of the Irish and of the learning of the Druid. His answer, which displays much erudition and ingenuity, we will give at large. Quote, "In respect to the dress of the ancient Irish bards, the subject is very obscure. Our historians and antiquaries have been very remiss in delivering down to the present age the dress of the ancient inhabitants of this isle. Imperfect hints are the only assistance they have furnished us with. I have, however, been at a considerable trouble in endeavouring to develop this part of our antiquities, and think at last I have been able to define with some precision most parts of the ancient dress of the Old Irish. Books in this investigation have been but of little assistance to me. It was from ancient sculptures, seals, and so on, found in several parts of the kingdom, that I have been enabled to throw any light on the subject. By collating these with the hints given in books, British coins, sculptures, and so on, it appears that the Old Irish dress was the same in all ages with the ancient British, and was universal in all the Celtic nations. According to McCurtain, the Irish bards in the 6th century wore long flowing garments fringed and ornamented with needlework, and from the Brehon laws, the bards in several instances were of the order of the nobles, from whence we may presume their dress was in most respects conformable thereto, which principally consisted in the triumph, long cota chanachas, and the vared, or beret. But from a basso relievo found in the ruins of New Abbey near Kilcullen, it appears that the dress of the bards consisted of the trúth, of the long coati, and cochel. The trúth or straight bracha was made of weft, covering the feet, legs, and thighs as far as the loins, fitting so close to the limbs as to discover every muscle and motion of the parts covered, and was striped, with several colours, according to the order of the rank of the wearer. The long cota, or coati, the camisium of the Latin writers, was a kind of a shirt made of plaited stuff or linen dyed yellow and ornamented with needlework, according also to the rank of the wearer. This shirt was open before and came as low as the mid-thigh. The trunk being thus open was folded round the body and made fast by a girdle round the loins. The sleeves of some were short, but in the figure before mentioned they were long, coming down to the wrist and turned up with a kind of military cuff. The bosom was cut round, leaving the neck and upper part of the shoulders bare. The cockle was the upper garment, a kind of a long cloak reaching as low as the ankles and fringed at the borders like shagged hair. From the neck pendant on the back and shoulders was a large cap or hood, ornamented with curious needlework, after the manner of those on the British coins. His beard was long, and his hair flowed on his neck and shoulders. His head was covered with the barret, or conical cap, and his harp, in good grace, was pendant before him. I have not been able to specify the colours which ornamented the bard's dress. Keating said that persons of learning had colours the same as the king's, but by the Brehon laws it appears that the bards were not of the first order of nobility, and therefore perhaps only wore 5 colours, viz. White, blue, green, black, and red. But of this I am not certain. These colours were laid on in stripes or wrought into the texture of the material." End quote. The latter conjecture is consonant with the idea of the anonymous author of an ode published in 1783 entitled The Order of St. Patrick. Thus he clothed Hibernia's guardian genius, quote, "her mantle green, inwrought with gold, as wore by kings and bards of old." End quote. But perhaps in order to acquire an idea of the dress of the ancient Irish bards, we must look on the party-coloured mantles of our modern heralds. In England, the minstrels of each noble house wore a distinguishing badge. Those belonging to the Northumberland family, for instance, wore silver crescents on their arms. Quote, "The minstrels of thy noble house, all clad in robes of blue, with silver crescents on their arms, attend in order due." End quote. This custom, it is very probable, prevailed, if not in the early, at least in the Middle Ages of this kingdom. Perhaps the colours in the bards' mantles varied according to the family to which they belonged. As the several classes of the bards were concerned in the Cuine, it will be necessary to give a particular account of that solemn ceremony. When a prince or a chief fell in battle or died by the course of nature, the stones of his fame were raised amidst the voices of the bards. On this occasion, the Druid, having performed the rites prescribed by religion and the pedigree of the deceased being recited aloud by his Seanacha, the Cuine, or funeral song, which was composed by the Filidh of the departed and set to music by one of his Orifidigh, was sung in recitativo over his grave by a rackery or a rhapsodist, who occasionally sustains his voice with arpeggios swept over the strings of his harp. The symphonic parts being performed by minstrels who chanted a chorus at intervals, in which they were joined responsively by attending bards and Orifidigh. The relations and friends of the deceased mingling their sighs and tears. Thus, Hector was lamented. Quote, "A melancholy choir attend around with plaintive sighs and music's solemn sound. Alternately they sing, alternate flow, the obedient tears melodious in their woe, while deeper sorrows groan from each full heart, and nature speaks at every pause of art." End quote. A scene how solemn, how affecting, but the custom was founded in sound policy. The bards were directed to seize this favourable opportunity, when the mind was softened by sympathetic sorrow, and every tumultuous passion soothed to peace by the plaintiveness of the music, to impress on the minds of their auditors a reverence and imitation of virtue, or of what, as Mr. O'Connor observes, in those days of hedonism was deemed virtue. This they endeavoured to effect by first lamenting in pathetic strains the loss they sustained in the death of their patron. Thus they grappled the attention of their hearers and awoke all their finer feelings. Then they dwelt on his virtues and heroism, recounting all his acts of humanity and all his valorous achievements, closing every stanza with some remarkable epithet of their hero. The ceremony was considered of such moment that the man to whom it was denied was deemed accursed, and his ghost supposed to wander through the country bewailing his miserable fate. Thus the woods and wilds became peopled with shadowy beings, whose cries were fancied to be heard in the piping winds or in the roar of foaming cataracts. Such apprehensions, as an elegant critic remarks, must indeed, quote, "deepen the murmur of the falling floods and breed a browner horror on the woods." End quote. In process of time, as luxury advanced, the funeral ceremony became so costly that the expenses attending it were regulated by the Brehon laws. Did our purpose require, but it does not, we would trace this ceremony through different countries and to the remotest antiquity. However, we will observe that David's lamentation for Jonathan and the conclamatio of the Phoenician Dido, as described by Virgil, coincide with the Cuine or Irish cry.